Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. The wind howled through the treetops, a low mournful sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I was standing at the edge of Blackwood Forest, an expanse of tangled trees and dark underbrush that no one in town dared to venture into after dusk, not even me. But tonight, I didn't have a choice. It was October, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. My breath came out in small, visible puffs as I stood there, shivering, more from fear than the cold. I should have known better than to make that bet. But how could I back down? They'd call me a coward, and in a small town like ours, that would stick with you for life. My name's Ethan Ward. I'm 22, born and raised in Maple Creek, a place so small you could walk from one end to the other in 20 minutes. Everyone knew everyone, and growing up, all the kids whispered stories about Blackwood Forest, the haunted woods, the cursed land, the place where the shadows moved on their own. No one knew where the tales started, but they'd been around for as long as anyone could remember. Still, those were just stories, right? Or so I thought. Until that night. I glanced back at my friends, Mike and Jared, who stood a few paces behind me, egging me on. "Come on, Ethan. You can't back out now," Jared called, grinning from ear to ear. Mike snickered, the beam of his flashlight bouncing around in the dark like an unsteady heartbeat. "It's just a quick walk to the old hunter's cabin and back. 15 minutes tops, and you're out. Prove you've got guts." It was the stupidest dare, but the way they framed it, I couldn't say no. Just a short trek into the woods, to the abandoned cabin that everyone said was cursed. Simple enough, right? Except my gut was screaming at me to turn back. The forest felt wrong tonight, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I adjusted my backpack and clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the gloom. "I'll be back before you know it," I said, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I'd hoped. With one last look at my friends, I stepped into the forest. The trees closed in around me like skeletal fingers, their twisted branches blocking out most of the moonlight. The trail was barely visible, just a faint indentation in the earth where the ground had been worn down over time. My flashlight flickered once, twice, before steadying again, but it did little to penetrate the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The wind, which had been howling at the edge of the forest, was now just a faint whisper. No birds, no crickets, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Just the sound of my footsteps and the steady thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I tried to focus on the path, but the stories I'd heard as a kid crept into my mind. Stories of people who entered Blackwood Forest and never came out. Of strange figures seen in the shadows. Of trees that moved when no one was looking. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts away. "It's just a walk to the cabin," I reminded myself. I'd be back soon, laughing about how easy it was. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to loom closer. My flashlight flickered again, and this time it stayed off for a full 5 seconds before sputtering back to life. I cursed under my breath and picked up my pace. I had to be close to the cabin by now. That's when I saw it, just ahead, barely visible through the trees. A faint outline, the jagged roof of the old hunter's cabin, poking through the branches. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I took a step closer, the air shifted, and the forest seemed to come alive around me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees, which had been so still, were moving. Not swaying in the wind, but actually moving. Branches creaked and groaned as they twisted and writhed, reaching out toward me like claws. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Then, I heard it. A soft whisper, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. "Ethan." My blood ran cold. I whipped around, my flashlight jerking in all directions, but there was no one there. The voice came again, closer now, but still distant, as if it was being carried on the wind. "Ethan." Panic surged through me, and I started running. I didn't care about the cabin anymore, I just needed to get out. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches grabbing at my clothes, scratching my skin. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. But no matter how fast I ran, the whisper followed me. "Ethan, why did you come?" I gasped for breath, my lungs burning, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My legs were aching, my chest tight with fear. The forest was alive now, the trees shifting and moving in ways that defied logic. Shadows danced between the trunks, and I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I burst through a clearing, and there it was, the cabin, standing in the middle of the woods like a forgotten relic. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cabin was even more dilapidated than I'd imagined, its roof sagging, the walls covered in moss and rot. The windows were shattered, black holes that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. But something was wrong. The door was open. I hadn't seen anyone enter, but the door was wide open, creaking slightly in the breeze that had suddenly picked up. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the open door, feeling the weight of the forest pressing down on me. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just inside the doorway. Tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, like the branches of the trees. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two pinpricks of light that pierced through the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. And then the whisper came again, so close it felt like it was inside my head. "Ethan, you shouldn't have come." I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it out of the forest, but somehow I did. The branches clawed at me, the shadows twisted and writhed, but I ran faster than I ever had in my life. The whisper followed me all the way to the edge of the trees, and even when I burst out into the open field, gasping for breath, I could still hear it. "Ethan, we'll be waiting." I didn't stop running until I reached my friends. They were laughing, thinking I'd chickened out and turned back early. But when they saw the look on my face, the scratches on my arms and the way my hands shook, their smiles faded. I never told them what I saw. I didn't have to, because every time I close my eyes, I see it. The figure standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. And every night, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear the whisper. It all started with a ring, a small, unassuming band of tarnished silver nestled inside an old wooden box that smelled of decay, and something far worse. I didn't know it then, but that ring was about to change everything. I should have left it where I found it, buried deep in the attic of my grandmother's house, among cobwebs and forgotten memories. But I didn't. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 28, and I've lived in Portland my whole life. After my grandmother passed away, it fell to me to clear out her old house, an aging Victorian mansion that had been in our family for generations. It wasn't the first time I'd been there, but something about walking through those dusty, creaking halls alone felt different. The air was thick with an unsettling quiet, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. The whole place felt wrong. I'd always heard the stories, of course. My grandmother had been a collector of sorts, antiques, trinkets, things no one really wanted or needed. But there were whispers in the family that some of her belongings were more than just old. Cursed, they said, possessed by something dark. I'd always brushed it off as superstition, just old wives' tales. Until that day. I was in the attic, sorting through boxes of old photographs and books when I found it. A small, intricately carved wooden box tucked behind a stack of dusty albums. It didn't look like much, but something about it caught my attention. The wood was old and worn, but the carvings were still sharp, symbols I didn't recognize, swirling in patterns that made my eyes hurt if I looked too long. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. Inside was the ring. It was simple, just a plain silver band, tarnished with age. But as soon as I touched it, a chill shot through me, like I'd grabbed a handful of ice. My hand recoiled, but something about the ring drew me back. It felt heavy, though it weighed almost nothing in my palm. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the air around it was thicker, darker, as though the ring was pulling something toward it, or maybe pulling me in. I slipped it onto my finger without thinking. I don't know why I did it. It was like something was guiding my hand, making me do it. And the moment the ring settled on my finger, I felt it, a shift, a wrongness. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees, and the shadows in the corners of the attic stretched unnaturally long. My breath fogged in the cold air, and for a moment, it felt like the entire house was holding its breath, waiting. Then just as quickly as it came, the feeling passed. The attic was silent again, the shadows still, the air back to normal. But something had changed. I could feel it. The ring, now snug on my finger, was warm, almost too warm. And though it was small, it felt as though it weighed 100 pounds. I should have taken it off right then and there. I should have thrown it back in the box and buried it at the bottom of the ocean, but I didn't. Instead, I slipped the box into my bag and finished up in the attic, trying to ignore the gnawing unease growing in the pit of my stomach. That night was the first time I dreamed of her. I was standing in a room I didn't recognize, dark, with only the faintest flicker of candlelight illuminating the space. The walls were covered in strange symbols, much like the ones on the wooden box, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt incense. In the center of the room stood a woman. She was beautiful in a way that was unsettling. Pale skin, dark hair that cascaded down her back, and eyes that seemed too large for her face, gleaming in the candlelight like black glass. She smiled at me, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was predatory, filled with something ancient and cruel. "You have the ring," she said, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo in my mind. "It belongs to me." I tried to speak, to ask who she was, but my voice wouldn't come. I could only stand there, frozen, as she took a step closer, her eyes fixed on the ring, gleaming on my finger. "Give it back," she whispered, her voice growing colder, "before it takes everything." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. My hand throbbed, and when I looked down, the ring seemed to gleam in the dim light of my bedroom. I tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. It was like it had fused to my skin. Panic surged through me, and I tugged harder, but it was no use. The ring wouldn't move. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The days that followed were strange. At first, it was just little things. A cold draft that seemed to follow me everywhere, even in the middle of a warm day. The feeling of being watched, though I was alone. Objects in my apartment would move just slightly, keys that weren't where I'd left them, lights flickering for no reason. But then, people started to die. The first was a coworker, Jessica. We weren't close, just casual work friends, but she was one of the first to notice the ring. She complimented it, asked where I got it. I shrugged it off, told her it was just some old family heirloom. She smiled, but something in her eyes darkened for a moment, like she knew something she wasn't telling me. 2 days later, she was dead. A freak accident, they said. She'd been walking to her car after work when a street lamp collapsed, crushing her instantly. No one saw it coming. No one could explain it. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. And it didn't stop with her. Next was my neighbor. an older man named Mr. Carroll. He was the kind of guy who always had a kind word or a wave when I saw him in the hallway. We talked once or twice about the weather, nothing more. But one morning, I found him at the bottom of the stairs, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open in terror. The police called it an accident, a fall, but I knew better. I started seeing her again, at night, in my dreams. The woman with the black eyes, always standing just out of reach, always watching. She never spoke after that first dream, but her presence was enough. I could feel her anger, her hunger, growing stronger each time she appeared. And every time someone died, the ring grew tighter. I tried everything to get it off. Soap, oil, even a pair of pliers. But nothing worked. The ring was stuck, and it was getting tighter by the day. My finger had turned red, swollen, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something worse happened. The worst part was, I didn't feel like myself anymore. There was a darkness growing inside me, feeding on my fear, my despair. I was becoming paranoid, jumping at every shadow, convinced that the woman in my dreams was watching me, waiting for me to slip. And then there was the rage. It came out of nowhere, sudden and violent. I snapped at people for no reason, broke things, screamed into the silence of my empty apartment. It wasn't me, it was the ring. I could feel it, twisting something inside me, warping my thoughts, my actions. It was late one night after yet another nightmare that I finally understood. The woman in my dreams, the one who wanted the ring, she wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was real. And she was coming for me. I needed answers. I searched everywhere for information on the ring, scoured the internet, went to libraries, even visited a few antique dealers, but no one knew anything. No one had ever seen anything like it, except one man. He was old, probably in his 70s, and he ran a small cluttered shop on the outskirts of town. When I showed him the ring, his face went pale. He refused to touch it, wouldn't even look at it for more than a few seconds. But he told me enough. The ring, he said, was cursed, bound to an ancient spirit, an angry, vengeful soul who had been wronged in life and now sought retribution in death. Anyone who wore the ring was marked. They would bring death and destruction to everyone around them, until the curse claimed their life as well. I asked him how to break the curse, how to get rid of the ring, but his answer was simple. You can't. There was only one way out, he said. The ring had to be passed on, willingly, to someone else, but doing that would condemn the next person to the same fate. I left the shop with the weight of that knowledge pressing down on me. I couldn't give the ring to someone else. I couldn't damn another person to this nightmare. But the ring was growing tighter. The deaths were getting closer. I knew it wouldn't be long before the curse came for me. As I sit here now, writing this, the ring feels like it's burning into my skin. I can barely move my finger. The darkness is closing in and I can feel her, watching, waiting. I don't know how much time I have left. But if you're reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't take the ring. Don't let the curse continue. Because once you wear it, it will never let you go. And death will follow. I've always believed in the untouchable nature of ghosts. Something about their intangible existence made them less terrifying, as though their lack of physical presence created a barrier between our world and theirs. But now, as I sit here, writing this, the hair on the back of my neck still prickles from that touch. The one I felt last night. The one that convinced me I was no longer safe in my own skin. You see, it's not just the unseen that haunts me anymore. It's the touch. It started a week ago. My name is David and I'm 32 years old. I live alone in a house just outside of Black Hollow, a small, sleepy town nestled between thick woods and steep hills. I never thought of the house as haunted. Why would I? I'd lived there for 5 years without so much as a creaky floorboard in the night or a mysterious cold breeze. But last Tuesday, something changed. I was in bed, half asleep, when I felt it. a light pressure on my arm like someone had brushed their fingers against my skin. Startled, I shot up in bed and flicked on the light, heart pounding. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. I forced myself to laugh it off, chalking it up to a vivid dream, but the sensation had felt so real. The next night I felt it again, this time on my back, as though someone had lightly pressed their palm there. I didn't even move this time. My eyes were wide open, staring at the dark ceiling as every nerve in my body lit up with terror. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a muscle twitch or a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew better. The third night, it escalated. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. The room was dimly lit, just the soft hum of the old refrigerator in the background. Suddenly, I felt cold fingertips graze the back of my neck. I froze, the plate slipping from my hands and shattering on the floor. My breath hitched, and I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one there. Just the empty kitchen, bathed in shadow. My heart was pounding. I wasn't dreaming. I was wide awake, and I could feel the lingering chill on my skin where the fingers had touched me. I backed out of the kitchen slowly, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. The house was silent, oppressively so. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed, the covers pulled tight around me like a child terrified of the monsters in his closet. But my monster wasn't hiding. It was already there, waiting. At 3 a.m., the touch came again. This time, it wasn't a gentle brush or light caress. It was a grip. Cold, firm fingers wrapped around my wrist, yanking me awake. I gasped and jerked my arm away, scrambling to turn on the bedside lamp. The light flooded the room, but I was alone. I stared at my wrist. There were faint, red marks, like something had been holding me too tight. Panic set in. I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was in the house, and it was getting bolder. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair, the lamp blazing, waiting for the next touch. But it never came. The following day, I called in sick to work. I wasn't sick, but there was no way I could focus with this nightmare unfolding around me. I needed answers, or at least someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. So I drove to the library and began researching the history of my house. That's when I found it. In the late 1800s, my house had belonged to a man named Charles Eldridge. Eldridge was a well-to-do doctor in Black Hollow, respected by the community but known for being a bit strange. According to the records, he had a morbid fascination with death and the afterlife. Some of his colleagues believed he was experimenting with ways to communicate with the dead, but nothing was ever proven. One night, Eldridge disappeared. His wife reported him missing, but no one ever saw him again. Some say he ran off, others believed he died in the house and that his spirit never left. I couldn't find much more than that, but the thought of living in a house where someone might have died, someone obsessed with death, it left a pit in my stomach. When I got home, the air felt heavy, like something was waiting for me. That night, the touch didn't come until just after midnight. I was lying in bed, eyes wide open, when I felt it. A cold, creeping hand sliding up my leg. I bolted upright, throwing the covers off me. Nothing, but I could still feel it. That lingering sensation like the imprint of cold fingers on my skin. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. The touches came more frequently, sometimes a light brush against my cheek, other times a full-on grip that left me gasping in terror. I couldn't stay in the house, but I didn't know where else to go. I tried staying with friends, but the touches followed me. It was on the 6th night that everything changed. I was sitting in my living room, the TV on for background noise, when I felt something new. The touch came, but this time, it wasn't just a cold hand. It was as if someone was sitting next to me. I could feel the weight of them on the couch, the cushions sinking slightly under their invisible form. My heart stopped. My body went rigid. Slowly, I turned my head, praying I wouldn't see anything. And I didn't. But I felt it. A cold breath against my ear. Then a whisper. "Let me in." I leaped from the couch, stumbling backward, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing closer, the air thick with something dark and suffocating. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I don't know what I thought a locked door would do against something that could touch me from beyond the grave, but it was all I had. I crawled under the covers, trembling, and waited. The night was long and silent. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the inevitable. But nothing happened. No touch, no whispers, no cold fingers wrapping around my wrist. The silence was almost worse. The next day I decided I had to leave. I packed a bag and made plans to stay with a friend in a neighboring town. But as I was about to walk out the door, something stopped me. A pressure against my chest, firm, insistent. It was as if someone had placed a hand there, holding me back. I gasped, stumbling, and the bag dropped from my hands. The touch lifted, but I knew whatever was in this house didn't want me to leave. That night, the final touch came. I was lying in bed, lights on, my eyes wide and unblinking, when I felt it. Two hands, cold and clammy, gripping my shoulders. They held me down, pressing me into the mattress. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The weight of those hands was unbearable, suffocating. And then, I heard it again. The whisper. "Let me in." The pressure lifted just as suddenly as it had come, and I shot up, gasping for breath. I looked around, wild-eyed, but the room was empty. My body was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it's chosen me, why it's decided to torment me with its touch. But I do know one thing: this isn't over. The phantom touch still lingers on my skin like a reminder that it's always there, waiting. And one day I fear it won't just be a touch. It'll be something far worse. I'm writing this as a warning. Don't ignore the touches, because once they start, they don't stop. And when ghosts get too close, there's no going back. People often think of funeral homes as somber, peaceful places where the dead are prepared for their final rest. But I've learned that's only half the truth. My name is Anthony Reyes, and for the past 12 years, I've worked as a funeral director in a quiet corner of Massachusetts. There's something about my funeral home, though, that sets it apart from others. You see, it's haunted, deeply, disturbingly haunted. And if you'll indulge me for a while, I'll tell you the stories that have convinced me of this. It began a few years ago, right after I took over the family business from my father. Our funeral home, Reyes Mortuary, has been in the family for generations. My grandfather built it in the early 1900s, back when the house was much smaller, just a 2-story building attached to a Victorian house. The business expanded over the decades as more people moved into town, but the core of the place, the embalming room, the viewing hall, and the chapel stayed the same. The first odd thing I noticed was a feeling, one that's hard to put into words. You know when you're alone in a room but can't shake the sensation that someone is watching you? That was my everyday reality in the mortuary. It wasn't constant, but it would come over me suddenly, as if the air had thickened around me, pressing down on my shoulders. At first, I brushed it off as part of the job. Handling the dead does strange things to your mind if you're not careful. But it wasn't long before I realized this was no trick of psychology. One evening, I was preparing for a wake the following morning. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m., and everyone else had gone home. I was alone, finishing up some paperwork in the back office, when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. At first, I assumed it was one of my assistants who'd forgotten something and returned. "Hello?" I called out, expecting a familiar voice to answer back. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving closer to the office door. I stood up, heart thudding, and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. The lights flickered slightly, as if reacting to a sudden change in the air. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel that cold, oppressive sensation again. Someone, or something, was there, watching. I shook it off. I had to. After all, I was in charge of the place now. I had to stay rational, but I couldn't deny what I'd felt, or what I'd heard. That was the first time I realized there might be more to the old stories my father and grandfather used to tell me. They always spoke about the Wanderer, a spirit they claimed haunted the mortuary since the early days. My father said he'd heard the footsteps himself countless times, but he never saw anyone. My grandfather, more of a skeptic, said it was the building's old bones settling. I had believed the same, until that night. Things escalated over the next few months. I wasn't the only one noticing strange occurrences. One of the night attendants, Jessica, quit suddenly after a particularly disturbing encounter. It was a Wednesday, I remember, and we had just finished an evening viewing. Jessica had stayed late to tidy up. As she was cleaning the chapel, she noticed a figure standing by one of the caskets. She assumed it was a mourner who had stayed behind, perhaps saying a final goodbye. But when she approached the casket, she found it empty. The figure, dressed in black, vanished before her eyes. Jessica never returned to work after that night. Other staff members began reporting similar incidents. Cold spots in the embalming room, whispers in the chapel when no one was there, doors opening and closing on their own. And always those footsteps, as if someone was pacing the hallways, restless, searching. The strangest thing, though, happened about a year into my tenure. It was the middle of winter, and we were preparing for the funeral of an elderly woman named Margaret Fisher. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep, and her family wanted a traditional service with an open casket. I had embalmed her myself, and the preparation had gone smoothly, nothing out of the ordinary. The night before the funeral, I stayed late again to make sure everything was perfect. The viewing room was set up, the flowers arranged, the casket polished. I stood there for a moment, looking at Margaret's peaceful face, satisfied with the work. Then, as I turned to leave, I felt something cold graze the back of my neck. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. There, on the far side of the room, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing by the door. It was human-shaped, but its edges were blurred, like smoke. I couldn't make out a face, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and heavy. I blinked, and it was gone. I rushed out of the room, my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night, and when I came back the next morning, the unease lingered. The funeral proceeded as planned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one in the room. Over the next few weeks, I started doing more research into the history of the mortuary. I dug through old town records, newspaper clippings, anything that might explain the hauntings. That's when I found something chilling. In 1925, just after my grandfather built the funeral home, a man named Richard Grover disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Grover had been a mortician himself, working out of his own home, but his business had begun to fail. Rumor had it that he was deeply superstitious, obsessed with the idea that improper burials could trap a soul between worlds. He believed that spirits of the dead could linger if they were not treated with respect. According to the records, Grover visited my grandfather just days before his disappearance, rambling about the need to protect the dead from restless spirits. My grandfather had dismissed him as a madman, but when Grover vanished, people started to whisper that he had been cursed or had gone mad from his obsession with the dead. What struck me most, though, was that Grover's body was never found. Some speculated he'd left town, while others believed he'd died and was buried in an unmarked grave. But there were a few who claimed Grover's spirit never left. They called him the Wanderer, a name that had been passed down through the years in connection with the strange happenings at the funeral home. I didn't know what to make of it, but it all seemed to fit too well with what I had experienced. The last incident I'll tell you about happened just a few months ago, and it's the one that finally convinced me to take the haunting seriously, too seriously. It was late again, and we had just finished a service for a young man who had died in a car accident. His family had insisted on an open casket, despite the severity of his injuries. The embalming process had been delicate, and I'd spent hours making him look as peaceful as possible. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed to clean up. As I walked through the viewing room, I felt that familiar cold presence again, stronger than ever. I tried to ignore it, but something compelled me to look at the casket. The lid was slightly ajar. I swear to you, I had closed it myself just an hour before. My heart pounded as I approached, the coldness intensifying with every step. I reached out, trembling, and pushed the lid open. The body was gone. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Was it a cruel prank? Had someone broken in? I rushed to the door, but it was locked. There was no sign of forced entry. Suddenly, the cold air swirled around me, and the lights in the room flickered. I felt it again, the same cold hand that had brushed against my neck before. But this time, it was stronger, more insistent. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and in the corner of the room, the shadowy figure appeared again, clearer this time. I could see its eyes, cold, empty pits that seemed to suck the light out of the room. And then, I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering my name. Anthony! I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The body was found in the casket the next morning, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had happened. Something unexplainable. Something terrifying. And whatever it wasn't finished with me. Since that night, the hauntings have grown worse. I hear voices now, not just footsteps. The cold touch has become almost a nightly occurrence, and the shadowy figure, it's no longer content to just watch. It follows me, even outside the funeral home. I don't know how much longer I can stay here, but I do know one thing. This place, this mortuary, is more than just a building. It's a gateway, a passage between the living and the dead, and whatever lurks within it is hungry. I'm telling you this not just to scare you, but to warn you. If you ever find yourself in Black Hollow, stay far away from Reyes Mortuary, because here, the dead don't rest, and neither will you. I had heard the stories growing up, but like everyone else in town, I brushed them off as old wives' tales. There was always a ghost story about some mysterious figure in every small town. Ours just happened to be about a lady who supposedly haunted the lake. People said she drowned herself there decades ago, pining for a lost lover who never returned from war. It sounded like the kind of story you tell kids to keep them away from the water at night. I never believed a word of it. Until that summer. I'm Alex, 27 years old, born and raised in the quiet little town of Blackwater Falls. It's the kind of place where nothing much ever happens, except for the occasional gossip at the general store or the annual fishing competition that attracts the same 30 people every year. But there was always something that kept me tethered to this town, despite how much I craved an escape. It was mid-July when everything started to change. That summer, I decided to rent a small cabin near the lake for a few weeks. I wanted some peace and quiet, a break from the humdrum of everyday life, and the solitude of nature sounded perfect. The cabin was old but cozy, wooden walls lined with the smell of pine and a large porch overlooking Blackwater Lake. The water stretched out, dark and still, framed by thick trees on all sides. It was beautiful during the day, but at night, it took on an eerie quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, lakes can be creepy at night when you're alone. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time fishing, hiking, and reading on the porch. The calm was exactly what I needed. But on the third night, something strange happened. I woke up around midnight, for no apparent reason. The cabin was dead silent. Not even the usual rustling of the leaves outside. A heavy stillness hung in the air. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then I heard it. A soft, distant splash. I sat up, my heart racing. It was faint, like something, or someone, had disturbed the water just enough to make a sound. I pulled back the curtains and looked out at the lake. The moonlight reflected off its surface, making it look like a vast, shimmering mirror. Nothing seemed out of place, but as I scanned the shoreline, my eyes landed on something, or someone, standing at the edge of the lake. A woman. She was barely visible, her figure almost blending into the mist that had started to roll across the water. She wore what looked like a long, flowing dress, and her hair hung loosely down her back. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a local who had wandered too close to the cabin, but something about her didn't seem right. She was too still, too pale. I watched her for what felt like an eternity, waiting for her to move, but she never did. She just stood there, staring at the water. The rational part of me wanted to go outside, call out to her, ask if she needed help. But another part of me, the part that had grown up on those ghost stories, froze. My mind raced back to the tales of the Lady of the Lake, the ghost of the woman who had drowned herself long ago. Could it really be her? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Ghosts weren't real. They couldn't be. But the next night it happened again. This time the splash was louder, closer. I rushed to the window, half expecting to see the woman standing there once more. But she wasn't at the shore this time. No, this time she was in the lake, standing waist deep in the water, her white dress clinging to her body as she stared directly at the cabin. At me. My breath caught in my throat. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they were hollow, black as the lake itself. A shiver ran down my spine and I stumbled back from the window, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something, or someone. I don't know how long I stood frozen in place, watching her, but eventually, she disappeared. One moment she was there. The next, the surface of the lake was calm and undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. I told myself I must have imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. Over the next few nights, the sightings became more frequent. The woman, no, the ghost, appeared at different times, always near the lake, always staring at the cabin. I began hearing her too. At first, it was just the splashes, but soon, whispers drifted through the air late at night. I could never make out what they were saying, but they filled me with a deep sense of dread. It was as if the very air around the cabin had become heavy with her presence. One night I decided to leave. I packed my bags, convinced that I couldn't stay there any longer. But as I was loading my car, I heard a voice, soft, almost pleading, "Alex?" I froze. The voice was coming from the lake. Slowly I turned, and there she was, standing on the shore, no more than 20 feet away. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time she spoke. "Come back." My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her voice was soft, almost pitiful, but there was something wrong with it. Something unnatural. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get in the car and drive as far away as possible. But I couldn't move. It was like her gaze had trapped me, held me in place. "Please, come back." I didn't know what she wanted, but every fiber of my being told me that if I went to her, if I took even one step closer, I wouldn't come back. Summoning every ounce of strength, I broke free from her gaze and ran. I didn't stop until I was behind the wheel, slamming the door shut and speeding down the dirt road, not daring to look back. I didn't return to the cabin. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Who would believe me? The Lady of the Lake was just a story, a ghost story meant to scare children. But I knew the truth. Weeks passed, and I thought I had escaped. But then the dreams started. Every night I dreamt of the lake, of her standing in the water, her black eyes staring into mine. whispering the same words over and over. Come back. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the dreams grew stronger, more vivid. I could hear her voice in my waking hours now, feel her presence, even when I was miles away from the lake. It was like she had marked me, tied me to that place. I knew deep down that I couldn't run forever. The Lady of the Lake wanted something from me, and I feared that one day, no matter how hard I tried to resist, I would return to her. Because you can only run from a ghost for so long before it catches up to you. And when she does, there's no escape. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, not like my grandmother did. She used to tell me stories when I was young, old Irish legends passed down through generations. The one that always stuck with me, though, was the banshee. In her tales, the banshee was a death omen, a ghostly woman who wailed to foretell the death of someone close. As a child, I used to laugh at the absurdity of it, but she would give me that hard, knowing look and tell me, "When you hear her cry, lad, there's no mistaking it." I should have listened. I'm Michael Kearney, 32 years old, born to a family with deep Irish roots. My grandmother raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was 6. She was a tough woman, sharp-tongued, but with a heart of gold buried underneath that rough exterior. She believed in the old ways, and though I loved her dearly, I always thought her tales were nothing more than the relics of a bygone era. How wrong I was. It was late October when I got the call. Granny had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news hit me hard, even though I knew it was coming. She had been sick for months. The funeral was in the old village where she had lived her entire life, a small isolated place on the west coast of Ireland. I hadn't been back in years. Life had taken me far away, first to university and then to a corporate job in London. But now, I was headed home. The village was as I remembered, small, bleak, and remote, perched on the edge of cliffs that overlooked the wild Atlantic. The wind was always howling there, and the sky seemed perpetually gray. Granny's house sat at the very edge of the village, an old stone cottage that looked like it had been there for centuries, untouched by time. As soon as I arrived, I could feel the weight of the place. There was something about the air, thick and oppressive, as if the land itself held on to the stories of the dead. The funeral went by in a blur, a mix of old neighbors and distant relatives, all paying their respects. But what struck me the most was how many of them spoke about Granny with reverence, as if she had some connection to things beyond this world. They spoke in hushed tones about her second sight, her ability to sense things, to know when death was near. I had heard those whispers growing up, but always brushed them off. That night after the funeral, I stayed in her cottage. I hadn't planned on it, but something drew me there. It felt wrong to leave it empty, abandoned so soon after her death. As I walked through the familiar rooms, I was struck by how little had changed. The same worn furniture, the same old photographs on the mantel, and of course, her rocking chair by the window, facing the cliffs. It was as if she was still there, watching the sea. I settled into the small bedroom where I used to sleep as a child. It felt strange being back, the wind howling outside, the waves crashing against the cliffs in the distance. But there was something else, a sound. Faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable once I heard it clearly. A wail. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me. The old house had always groaned and creaked in storms. But this wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. It was a mournful cry, long and drawn out, like someone was weeping in the night. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was my imagination, grief playing tricks on my mind. But the sound grew louder, closer. My heart began to race as the wailing filled the air, a piercing, sorrowful cry that sent a chill down my spine. I rushed to the window and peered out, half expecting to see someone standing on the cliffs, but there was no one. just the endless black of the night and the restless sea. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the wailing stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, waiting for the sound to return. But all I heard was the wind. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was nothing, that I was just shaken from the funeral. But deep down, I knew. I knew what I had heard. The banshee. The next morning, I asked around the village, carefully bringing up the sound I had heard. Some of the older folks gave me knowing looks but said nothing. Others avoided the topic altogether. But there was one man, old Seamus O'Leary, who spoke plainly. He was sitting outside the pub, nursing a pint, when I approached him. "So you heard her, did ya?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. I hesitated. "Heard who?" "The banshee," he said, his eyes narrowing. "She cries for the Kearneys, always has. Your granny knew her well." I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of whiskey. "The Kearneys have always had the gift, lad. Your granny, she could see things, hear things. She knew when death was near, and so does the banshee." I stared at him, my mind racing. "So you're saying she—" "Aye," he interrupted. "She's warning you, someone close to you, someone in your bloodline. Death's coming for them." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was crazy, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a curse. I left him there, his words echoing in my mind. That night, the wailing returned. Louder this time. Closer. I lay in bed, the covers pulled up to my chest, my heart pounding as the cry of the banshee filled the house. It was unbearable, a sound that clawed at my soul, full of sorrow and despair. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stormed out of the house, determined to find the source of the noise. I wouldn't let some old legend scare me, not in my own home. I walked to the cliffs, the wind whipping at my face, the sound of the sea crashing below. And then I saw her. She was standing at the very edge of the cliff, her back to me, her long white hair blowing in the wind. She wore a tattered dress, pale as moonlight, and her figure was so thin, so gaunt, she looked almost skeletal. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. She didn't turn around, but I could feel her presence, heavy and ancient. My legs trembled as I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the mist. And then she turned. Her face was a nightmare. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, her skin stretched tight over bone. But it was her eyes that terrified me the most. They were empty, lifeless. Yet somehow they were filled with a deep, sorrowful knowing. She opened her mouth, and the wail escaped her lips again, that same mournful cry that had haunted me for nights. But now, standing so close to her, I could feel it, the grief, the sorrow, the loss. It washed over me like a wave, suffocating me with its intensity. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my mind flooded with images of death and loss. Faces of people I loved, gone too soon. And then, just as suddenly, she vanished. The next few days passed in a blur. I left the village, unable to shake the feeling that the banshee's cry had been meant for me. But I didn't know what it meant. I didn't understand, that is, until the phone call. It was my sister, Maeve. She was frantic, her voice shaking as she told me the news. Dad had died. Suddenly. A heart attack, the doctors said. There had been no warning, no signs, just gone. The weight of Seamus's words came crashing down on me. The banshee's cry had been a warning. I hadn't listened, hadn't understood. As I sat there, numb with grief, I heard it again. The wail. Distant this time, but unmistakable. The cry of the banshee. She wasn't done. And I knew without a doubt that death was not finished with my family. I never wanted to move into this house. But when you're 25, broke, and clinging to whatever sense of stability you can get, you don't have many choices. So, when I saw the listing for a 2-bedroom house in a quiet suburb for half the price of rent anywhere else, I couldn't say no. It seemed too good to be true. And, as I would soon find out, it was. The house itself was old, a relic from the 1920s with creaky wooden floors, cracked paint, and windows that rattled when the wind blew. The landlord had said the place had character, but I think neglected would have been a better word. But what really caught my attention, what gnawed at the back of my mind the moment I walked through the door, was the basement. The entrance was a narrow, rotting wooden door at the far end of the kitchen. The landlord hadn't even mentioned it during the tour, and when I asked about it, he brushed it off. "Oh, just storage space," he said, waving his hand like it was nothing. His casual attitude didn't match the way his eyes flickered nervously toward it when I brought it up. I moved in a week later. At first, things were fine, uneventful, even. The house had its quirks, sure, like how the floorboards creaked even when no one was walking on them, or how the lights would flicker at random. I chalked it up to the age of the place, but it was the basement that lingered in the back of my mind. I hadn't gone down there yet. Something about it made my skin crawl, like an unspoken warning in the air. Every time I passed by the door, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then, one night, I heard it. It started as a soft thumping sound. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard it echoing through the floorboards. A rhythmic, almost deliberate noise, like someone knocking gently from below. I shot up, heart racing. My first thought was that it was a raccoon or a rat. Maybe something had gotten into the house. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The sound continued for a few minutes, then stopped. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for it to return, but the house fell silent. When morning came, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination getting the better of me. The next night, it happened again. Only this time, it wasn't just thumping. There was something else. A dragging sound, slow and heavy, as if something was being pulled across the concrete floor of the basement. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to it. My rational mind tried to offer explanations, but nothing made sense. I had to know. The next morning, after another sleepless night, I finally decided to open the door to the basement. My hand hesitated on the knob, the air around me thick with dread. When I pulled the door open, a musty, damp smell hit me like a wave. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the dark. The light switch didn't work, of course, so I used the flashlight on my phone to illuminate the room. The basement was exactly what you'd expect: concrete floors, cobwebs, and old boxes of junk left behind by previous tenants. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of old furniture, was a hole. It wasn't big, maybe 3 feet wide and deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom. The edges of the hole were jagged, like it had been clawed out of the ground. I stared at it, the light from my phone shaking as my hands trembled. The logical part of my brain told me it was probably an old drainage hole or something, but the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I backed away, slowly at first, then faster as panic set in. I rushed up the stairs, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about that hole. What was it? How long had it been there? And more importantly, why did it feel like something was watching me from it? That night, the noises were louder. The dragging sound was now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I could feel it reverberating through the walls, vibrating in my bones. I lay in bed, wide-eyed, clutching the blanket to my chest like it could protect me from whatever was down there. Then the smell came. It seeped through the floorboards, a rancid, decaying odor that filled the house. I gagged, covering my nose and mouth with my shirt, but it was no use. The stench was overpowering, like rotting meat left out in the sun for days. I had to leave the house, but when I stepped out of bed, the thumping started again, This time, it wasn't soft. It was angry, violent, shaking the walls. I froze. Then I heard the basement door creak open. I hadn't touched it, I was sure of that. I stood there, heart pounding, staring down the hallway at the open basement door. My phone was on the nightstand, too far to reach without moving. But something told me not to move, not to make a sound. I listened, every muscle in my body tense. The dragging sound was closer now, as if it had moved up the stairs. And then, I heard it. The sound of something wet slithering across the floor. I slowly turned my head toward the door of my bedroom. The floorboards creaked under the weight of whatever was out there. Then, I saw it. A shadow, long and twisted, stretched across the hallway wall, moving toward my room. I could hear its heavy breathing, raspy and uneven, like it was struggling to take each breath. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor. The door to my room creaked open. The shadow grew darker, more defined. And then I saw it, just for a moment. A figure, hunched and crawling, its skin pale and slick, with two long limbs that scraped the floor. Its eyes, black, empty voids, locked onto mine. I don't know how, but I managed to move. I slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it, backing away until I hit the wall. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. The operator's voice was calm, almost too calm. I tried to explain, but the words tumbled out in a frantic mess. "There's something in my house. It's in the basement. It came upstairs." "We'll send someone right away," the operator said, but it felt like an eternity. The thumping continued, louder, more insistent, and then I heard it at the door. Scratching. The creature dragged its nails along the wood, the sound sharp and deliberate, like it was toying with me. I pressed my ear against the door, listening, trying to hold my breath. It stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it was gone. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. But then, from the other side of the door, I heard it whisper. It was a low, guttural sound, barely more than a breath. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them crawl under my skin, chilling me to the bone. I backed away, my entire body trembling. The police arrived minutes later. By the time they got there, the house was silent again. They searched every inch of the place, found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no tracks, no hole in the basement. It was like the creature had never existed at all. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I haven't been back to the house since. I left everything behind, clothes, furniture, even my car. Sometimes though, late at night, I can still hear it. The dragging, the thumping, the scratching at the door. It's waiting, and I know deep down it will never leave.